Hi, we enter into 1 Samuel 17 today in the beginning of the story of David and Goliath. If you didn't watch the introductory video, which I already posted, I really encourage you to do that if you're not familiar with some of the issues that scholars work with in engaging this story. Some of the issues we looked at last time you can see here. The textual questions, it's a big chunk of the story that's in most people's Bibles, is in the Hebrew but not in the Greek, and we'll look at that as we go. Cultural questions about how we see Philistines now, and ancient questions about the role of Greek imagery and weapons and defensive armor here in the story, and then the question of David's sling, which we'll get to later. So if those are not familiar to you, I encourage you to watch the video, the introductory video that is already posted. As we've been doing, we've been going through the three stories of David's introduction to both Saul and the audience, whether that's the audience in the story or the audience listening or reading the story like us. And as we can see, the story we're about to enter now is much longer. And the piece I have up here only starts in 17:10. We're starting at 17:1. And so it's the entire chapter and perhaps a little of chapter 18 as well. So it's 3 or 4 times longer than the other stories and has a lot of detail, which is what leads scholars to, among other things, to think it's written at a different time or with a different cultural context. And we'll be looking at some of those details as we go. And I wanted you to also see that end of chapter 16 and the beginning of chapter 17 is a very full stop. Chapter 16 began continuing after Samuel and Yahweh had spoken about God's rejection of Saul, and so there was a continuity there, even though we looked at there the introduction to the history of David's rise, usually understood as beginning in 1 Samuel 16. But there was really no sharp break there, and the stories in chapter 16 that we looked at, the two on the blue and the green here, really continue directly from the story of the rejection of Saul in 1 Samuel 15. But as you can see here, this is a full stop. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah and Ephes Dammim. All of those names other than Judah we've never heard before, and they're almost all unique to this location in the Bible, although not completely, as we'll see. So there's a set piece going on here. The Philistines gathering for battle, and then we see in the verses that follow the Israelites gathering for battle. So it's really slowing down the action to set up this fixed scene, unlike any of the other battle scenes we've saw. The closest one is Jonathan and his servant back in chapter 14, who are on one side of a mountain and the Philistines on the other. But this is with a valley in the middle, not on opposite sides of the mountain, but on opposite mountains. And we'll look at a map of that in just a minute. It's not as much of a mountain as one might think. And we'll see throughout here, the Philistines are named endless times, either collectively or singularly. Goliath is only named Goliath twice, once in our passage today and once near the end. Otherwise, he's many, many times as simply the Philistine. And so what we're looking at is a characterization of him as typical of them, as representing them, as the convention of single combat, of course, would suggest that he represents the people, but also that he represents them, that his name isn't what's important, that he's the one that comes out from the group, and we'll see that in just a couple of verses. And so the characterization we have of Goliath seems to represent the Philistines as a whole. But it's a little more complicated than that when we look at the specifics of Goliath, as we'll see in just a minute. So one of the things I posted here in this chart, sorry, not in that one, in this version, are the key words that are used in this section. You see there's not much in here. The word for battle that you see here, milkama, which is also the word for war, sometimes translated here as ranks, which is to say gathered for war, and sometimes people are called that as a man of war rather than simply as a warrior or a soldier or something like that. So we see, not surprisingly, that in a scene that's a battle scene, that word is in here a number of times. And we see both the idea of ranks and of battle many times here, as well as fighting and killing and defying and all those words we might suggest go as part of the story. We're also looking at this as part of a chiastic shape, loosely chiastic. The beginning and the end clearly match, and the taunting matches. The middle depends upon whether we're following the Septuagint, which is only the part in the C1 here, or the Hebrew, which includes all of this whole section here. But today we're only going to look at this first part. So let's have that up with this here. And actually, I'm going to put the map up because we see a lot of geographic details as we look at this beginning passage. So first we see this location is right in here. And Soka here is understood as 14 miles west of Bethlehem. But you can see from my note below, it's mentioned a couple of times in Joshua and once in 1 Kings, but we otherwise know little about it. The idea that it belongs to Judah, though, is a much more important note than Soka itself, because we've not heard much about Judah. We've only heard Judah twice in a list list of how many soldiers they brought in 11:8 and 15:4, as you can see in the note below. And in both of those cases, the number of soldiers provided by Judah was only a small fraction of those provided by Israel. The numbers are extreme, several 100,000 soldiers, and that's certainly an exaggeration. But the highlight is that Israel is providing 90% of the people, and Judah only a small part. And many scholars will argue, especially Baruch Halpern, that the existence of a people or a nation called Judah, whether that we think of it as a geographic region or a group of people identified as Judahites, is a function of the David story and the life of David itself. There's not much evidence that there was a group or a place known as Judah before that. So this is a little bit anachronistic, and it's suggesting one of the many reasons why the story might have been written later. But when later exactly, we're not going to get in those details. So they gathered there at Socoh, as you can see, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah here in Ephes Dammim. And Azekah is also only mentioned once, a couple times in Joshua, along with Socoh, so just as a location there. But the key thing, as Sumora knows, is it controls the main road across the valley of Elah. So this is the Philistine area in the Shephelah, the coastal plain where they had their cities, the 5 cities of the Philistines you see listed here. And this suggests that they're trying to make an incursion across the mountains into the areas here, and whether that's to plunder or to control, we don't know. Of course, they're going to be pushed off here, but that's not going to be the end of the battle with the Philistines. The text doesn't say anything about the Philistine strategy, though. We're going to see this almost all from the perspective of David and the Israelites, and because the Philistines are being othered. They're not being presented as a people who have rational basis for wanting to engage in one activity or another, but as representative by a giant beast who can barely walk and is fooled into being killed by an inexperienced shepherd boy. Or is he, as we'll see. So going down to verse 2, and I'll move this up the screen a little bit so we can see a little more of our passage. Saul and the Israelites, notice not the Judahites there. We just saw that the Judah was part of it, but now just Saul and the Israelites, who are the people that he's been the king of, gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah. So they're originally going to be in this valley, which is this area here. We'll look at the Google Maps of it in a second, and formed ranks against the Philistines. And just to finish through verse 3, to see the setup, the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side. This is again repeating the theme of the Battle of Mishmash, but we'll see this issue of one side and the other side is really important, because jumping ahead a little bit, the word that's translated a champion to describe Goliath, Ish Haben Aim here, literally means a man between. And so whether that's the man who's going to come down between the mountains, or it might mean something else, scholars have worked with, and we'll get to that when we get there. So there's this valley in between, and they're on both sides of the mountain. But let's just look briefly at these images here from Google Maps, so you can see here's this area, and of course it's marked for tourist purposes, if nothing else, as the exact spot where this took place. And we'll look in a moment whether this is even something we can think of as a historical story or not. Or whether it's something that's made up for the purpose of expressing some theological point about God being the victor here and David attributing his victory to God. And we'll look at that more in a moment. But when we look at this Google map here from a 3D angle, you can see it's really not much of a mountain. It's really not very high. There's certainly a valley in between there. Whether people could yell out across that distance and hear each other is another question, but we don't have to suggest this is all that realistic in a story that certainly sounds folkloric in many ways, and we'll look at many aspects of that as we go. So out there came from the camp of the Philistines the man between named Goliath, and only here in 1723 is he named. 27 times, though, he's simply called the Philistine. As Simona Rodin suggests in her book on this, a whole book on this topic, she suggests the name comes from a Greek weapon. I'm not going to get into detail of that, but she does note that there are a number of names, both in the Bible and in other traditions, like the Greek traditions, where especially in war situations, people have nicknames, either based on their place or their skills or their weapons. I think of something like the Dread Pirate Robert, which is both from a movie and then was taken up by someone who was doing cryptocurrency nefarious activities. And neither of them were actually the real name, but we know that famous character, like many characters like that. So whether Goliath is a real name or not, it's hard to know. That would parallel David, which means beloved, and the suggestion is that maybe David is not his real name either, that's simply a title for him, that David is simply the beloved. But Goliath of Gath, which you see here, is one of those cities, and we'll see later noted that Ekron and Gath are the two places where the battle is beginning to take place. But this leads us to have to recognize that this is not the only story of a Goliath in the Hebrew Bible. There's another one in 2 Samuel 21, and we need to look at that here. So as we can see there, it says, Then there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, son of Jair Oragim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Which of course echoes the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam here, and leads scholars to question what's going on here. Were there two people named Goliath, both who were giants and both who had a shaft of a spear that was like a weaver's beam, or is there some other way to look at it? And one way to look at it, the way that I just suggested from Rodan, is that the word Goliath is not a specific name, so there could be many people with that name if it's just referring generically to a tall person or a person armed in a certain way. That's a possibility. Another possibility from Garfinkel, and I'll bring up his table 3 from his book here, is that you can see that he's suggesting that the description of Goliath here is taken from the wider piece there from 2 Samuel 21 of 4 late battles, each element of which is then incorporated in the description here. And that's a possibility here. The implication of Garfinkel is, and a number of other scholars who would take a similar view, is that the story in 2 Samuel 21 is the, quote, real story, and the story in 1 Samuel 17 is made up as an echo of that. It's impossible to analyze which one is real and which one is not historically. There's simply no physical evidence of any kind. But the fact that both those stories are there leads scholars to have to grapple with it one way or another. And he's famously tall. Here, his height is described as 6 cubits in a span. Interesting, cubits is almost always used for measuring buildings. So you see in my note below, most famously for the Ark in Genesis 6, but also for the Mishkan, the traveling shrine that the Israelites are told to make, and many chapters describe that in Exodus, and so there are many uses of cubit in the Mishkan. Or Solomon's Temple, which is the opposite of the Mishkan, and that's something I take up in my book, Come Out My People, but that's for another day. Or Ezekiel's visionary new temple. So 4 different kind of objects, the Ark and the Mishkan and 2 temples with cubits, and so Goliath here is implicitly likened to a building. A cubit, if you're not familiar, is the measure from a fingertip to an elbow, and since not everybody's fingertip to elbow is the same length, it's not a fixed length like a foot or a meter might be in modern measurements. But scholars suggest it's approximately 1.5 feet, so that would make Goliath a little over 9 feet, between 9 and 10 feet. A span is the distance from your fingertip to the end of your wrist, and so a little between 9 and 10 feet tall, which is awfully tall, and there are a number of other descriptions of giants in the Bible. Whether we're to take that as a literal description of somebody or an exaggeration, you have to decide. But he's not only described in terms of height, he's described in great detail, 3 verses here of what he wears. And so let's look at some of that, both in light of the chart that we looked at from Garfinkel, but also in light of something I'll show you in a minute from Yadin in terms of the Homeric echoes here. So he has a helmet of bronze here, a kova for helmet. Nikosheth is the word for bronze, or literally for copper. And kova is only in Isaiah 59 and Jeremiah and Ezekiel you see there, and a couple of places. In Isaiah place, let's just look at that briefly, where it's the metaphorical use of all these things, a righteousness like a breastplate, a helmet of salvation on his head, etc., which is the similar imagery. And in the late Isaiah 59, might be well exposed to the same cultural context as the authors of this story were. So he's wearing this helmet and armed with a coat of mail here, literally dressed, as Alter notes. The word for coat of mail, Veshiron, is first here, and after this only Saul's description and a couple of other times again in the Isaiah passage. So we're seeing how rare these are used. Israelites are, other than the brief reference to Saul, are never described wearing any of these things. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and the word for weight, mishkal, is only a couple other places. So these rare words are examples of scholars' basis for thinking the stories from a later time and place using much different vocabulary, since this is certainly not the only war scene or the only time in 1 and 2 Samuel where things would be weighed out. The image of 5,000 shekels of bronze is roughly 100, or maybe a little more than that. They're roughly 3 shekels of bronze per ounce, but we don't know for sure of that. But it's a lot, and if you can imagine trying to walk around wearing 100 pounds of that along with the other things. And then he had greaves of bronze on his legs. The Mitchan here is only here in the Masoretic text, but as Samora notes, it's commonplace in the Iliad, and that's what we'll come to in just a moment. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze. Hedon here, Hedon, could be a sword-like weapon, as Samora also notes, and again, only in Joshua, so there's definitely some connections there. And here's an example from Rodin's book of what a Corinthian soldier looks like wearing these greaves with a helmet. So that's what we're to picture. I couldn't find a picture of that kind of coat of arms that would weigh that much, though. And the shaft of the spear, the shaft of a spear like a weaver's beam, is famous for that description here, and my note has it down below as parallel to the passage we looked at. The phrase "a shaft of a spear" here is weird in the Masoretic because there's two different words from two different versions here. So it either can mean the wood part or the arrow-like part for the shaft. So it can mean the material of the spear or the point at the end, like a weaver's beam. And scholars have done an enormous amount of work to explore the question of weaver's beam, if for no other reason than the phrase kimnor or gim here. Menor here is the word for the beam, but it's only in the parallel in 2 Samuel 21. And if you notice there, it's that Elhanan was the son of Jare or Agim, which is to say a forest weaver or something like that, which makes no sense. And so there's some question of whether the weaver's beam image is taken from his family tradition here, that who he's the son of. It's hard to know. And the head of the spear weighs 600 shekels of iron, so not being measured in shekels of bronze, but shekels of iron. Samora estimates that as about 15 pounds, but again, that's a guess. And his shield bearer went with him. And this is overstating it. We'll see David's also described as a shield bearer, but the phrase is more generic than that, really his baggage assistant. It's not necessarily implying that he's carrying the shield at all. So let's take a pause now, having looked at that, and look at Yadin's chart here, which shows this example from the Iliad of someone described in similar armor and similar imagery. And we'll see that that image there from the Iliad, I won't read through it, you can read through that yourself, also suggests something that may be parallel in the next chapter, because the two characters in the story here are very close related, and there's been scholarly questions about how intimate they were, and a similar question will arise in 1 Samuel 18 about David and Saul's son Jonathan. So perhaps scholars in Greek mode were continuing into chapter 18 and not just stopping here. So that sets up our scene, and we'll see how the Israelites respond to this in the second part of the chiasm, as Goliath stands there and taunts the Israelites to see if they're not afraid to send a champion of their own to take him on in single combat. See you next time.